Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to lesson 13a. We're talking about World War I. And this is really going to be an opportunity for us to make a break from what would be kind of historical world history to more modern world history. And the event that really divides that is World Wars I and II, two events over the course of about 30 years that really radically change the way the world is put together and the way that power is shared in the world. World War, as the name would suggest, is a war in which a number of different players around the world participate, and also that has an impact around the world. And that's certainly what we're going to be talking about in this lesson. So a quick preview. We're going to look at, before the battles actually started, what were the system of alliances that was holding Europe specifically together. Who was allied with who was a friend, who was a foe. That's going to define a little bit about what was going on in the war itself. We're going to talk about the beginning of the war, kind of a strange way of starting a world war. We'll see that. We'll focus on the fact that World War I was really a new type of war. We saw different technologies and different strategies that we'd never seen before. And then finally we'll talk about the victory of the Allies. Your reading is going to be chapter 23. You're about 10 pages from pages 717 to 727. So take a look at those. And as you're looking at that particular assignment, please also look for these terms: conscription, mobilization, propaganda, total war, and trench warfare. Those are going to be the terms that I want you to look for, and expect to see those on your assignment. So, before the war breaks out, Europe is really divided up into these groups of alliances, or teams, if you want to think about it that way. Really, we see there's a war in 1870 called the Franco-Prussian War, which really starts to divide Europe into these two major camps. And really what the alliances are designed to do is to balance the power. If you're on one team and that team is equally matched with another one, there's not a real incentive to start to battle each other. So that's what the design was, that the alliances would balance that power. But what it really leads to is two main rival blocks. So Group A and Group B do not like each other. They're about equally as powerful, but we see them starting to break down with the events that led to World War I. So, at the eve of World War I in 1914, we had two major alliances. We had the Triple Alliance, and that was Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. And we had the Triple Entente, which was England, France, and Russia. Now, the United States is neutral during this time frame. Up until the beginning, and actually a little into World War I, the United States stays neutral because it doesn't consider itself to be part of Europe. It wants to stay out of Europe's battles. So what leads to, from this balance of power, to actual war? Well, really it's a number of different things that break down. The Ottoman Empire that was focused on present-day Turkey is being destroyed by nationalism. So the areas, the outlying areas, are starting to crumble because people are having nationalist feelings and wanting to have kind of their own rights. Austria-Hungary, which is the other most powerful Eastern European nation, starts to exert some influence over the area called the Balkans. And the Balkans is really that area that today we would look at as Serbia and Croatia and Albania, the area just to the east of Italy. A Serbian nationalist assassinates the Austrian Archduke, kind of a prince, named Ferdinand. And Austria-Hungary, the nation that has lost its Archduke, sees this assassination as an opportunity to invade Serbia and try to consolidate its power in Serbia. Germany, however, because it's allied to Austria, supports them and uses this as an excuse to kind of move out and try to take over territory in the east and west. On the other side of things, now that Germany and Austria have made moves, we now have Russia and France mobilizing to respond to Germany's advance. So it's this domino effect that occurs because of the alliances. So, at the very beginning of World War II, we essentially have two major camps, or World War I, excuse me, two major camps that both have war plans that they intend to follow. They've had them for years, back since the 1870s, and they're going to put these plans into action. It's like a coach going into a football game. Here's the plays I want to run. Doesn't matter. I'm going to run them. The German war plan, Germany being one of the major aggressors here, really calls for a quick victory in the west, so push very quickly into France and the Low Countries, and then battle Russia in the east. So Germany starts off with this as a plan, and it makes an initial offense into a neutral country called Belgium, which is north of France, and it tends to kind of circle around and invade France. Germany assumes that Belgium, which is a small and fairly weak country in Europe, will not fight, but they do. And the Belgian resistance, the fact that they're fighting and holding up the Germans, really messes up the German timetable and allows for France and England to develop defenses. So now they're being able to step it up. So Germany, that wanted to quickly take care of the Western Front and then move to the Eastern Front, has messed up its timetable, and the other nations are able to respond. Now, as we talked about before, this really leads to a new type of war. We have the Industrial Revolution that's now kicked in, and World War I is really the first opportunity for all these industrial powers to show off their military might. So we're seeing new technologies leading to changes in weapons. Things like tanks, the machine gun, airplanes, zeppelins or blimps, artillery, cannons that can fire for many, many miles, and then also poisonous gas, things like mustard gas, are some technologies that are used in war incredibly effectively in World War I for the first time. They lead to a lot of deaths. One of the reasons for those deaths is that the tactics that's used by the military don't change. So they still plan on lining up lots of men, moving in a line to try to take over the other side, and what happens is things like tanks and the machine gun just mow them down. And so we have this potential for a massive slaughter of troops because we have old tactics but new weaponry. And that's really what it leads to. As a matter of fact, it's so bad that neither side has any kind of distinct advantage. The death rate is horrific and things stall out. So the armies, in order to try to prevent themselves from being massacred, dig trenches. And that attempts to protect them from artillery and machine gun fire. And every now and then they'll be sent what's called over the top, where they have to climb out of their trench and go through what's called no man's land to try to take over the other enemy trenches. And you can imagine that that leads to huge amounts of losses for very small territorial gains. We also see that millions and millions of troops are dying in this fashion, also from things like disease and cold, frostbite, things of that sort are rampant. So it's a pretty awful, awful situation, and certainly not one that's conducive to a quick and painless military strike. Something happens, however, that leads to the tide turning towards the Allies, or the Triple Entente, which is the French and English side of things. And that is that the United States enters the war on the side of the Western powers. It does this because a ship called the Lusitania, which is sailing through the Atlantic, is destroyed by a German U-boat or submarine, and a number of Americans are killed. This leads for the United States to have a good excuse to enter. It's been neutral, it now enters on the side of the West. And that leads to new troops, new material, which then turn the tide of the war. Just the vast number of Russian troops also start to overwhelm the Germans and the Austria in the east. So we have this push from the east by the Russians and the push from the west by the Americans and the English and French, and the central powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, eventually have to surrender. What happens when the surrender occurs is really that the Allies differ on how to make some sort of a peace. How do we make a peace that allows Europe to maintain some sort of stability when also still inflicting a little bit of consequence on the aggressors, Germany and Austria-Hungary? Well, President Woodrow Wilson, who's the American president, really pushes for a fair peace and comes up with an idea called the League of Nations, which is a group of nations that can talk things out. It's the precursor to the United Nations of today. However, France and England, who have had much worse losses over the course of the war than the United States, want to punish Germany and Austria and really make it a difficult peace. And the peace is decided in what's called the Treaty of Versailles. And what happens is Germany is punished. So Germany loses a significant amount of territory and must pay back the nations of France and England and the United States for its losses. Austro-Hungary is essentially broken up. It no longer becomes a country, and it's broken up into little pieces, and the Ottoman Empire is also broken up into little pieces. What that does is it leads to an imbalance in Europe. So no longer do we have two camps that are about equally matched. We now have smaller countries that are broken up and an imbalance of power in Europe. What that really does is it sets the stage for World War II. And we're going to see that Germany, after being embarrassed and humiliated and going through some very difficult times in the 1920s and 1930s, really rebounds, pulls itself back together under fascism, and develops a war machine like we've never seen before at the beginning of World War II. And we'll talk about that in the next unit.